evening, everybody, and welcome to a live stream for the 18th of October 2023. And going to be bringing you the latest from the events taking place in occupied Palestine and some updates from the visit of Putin to the Belt and Road Forum out in China, and some interesting comments that he had to make to the Russian press shortly afterwards. Those are worth investigating. Putin indeed having something of a laugh at Biden's expense, which is to be expected. I wish that more people could. But unfortunately, Biden is still somebody who we have to take to some degree seriously. So, couple of pieces of business before we get started. The book group, or reading group if you prefer, on Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. The first episode of that is going to be out on Friday. Keep an eye out for that. Also going to be experimenting with a couple of live streams for people who are subscribers on Patreon, so keep an eye out for those popping up tomorrow as well. Now we do a bit of a roll call through those who are in the chat so far. So hello to PM, hello to Banana Bender, good morning to you, who says Free Palestine, and rightly so. Good evening or good morning or good afternoon to Burke, and hello to Jay over there in Norfolk, Virginia, where another small naval task force apparently left this morning heading east. And Putin, of course, has commented upon this, and we'll come to Putin's comments about that later on. Excuse me. President Jesus, good evening to you. Good afternoon to Alan out there in Oakland, California. Good morning to Ash in Melbourne. And hello to CRVS up there in the Nordic countries. Our very own Viking audience tuning in this evening. And hello to Irish Partisan out there in Minsk just after midnight. So good morning to you. And hello to Morgan. Good evening to you. And Banana Bender says, martyrs may be gone but not forgotten. Very true. Austin says hello and good evening to you. And hello to Slava out there in Chicago. And good evening to Michael and Satyajit Malik, hello to you. Slava says there is a Jewish-led pro-Palestine protest in the capital right now. Yeah, and it's making like loads of American reactionaries of all stripes go absolutely batshit crazy. I noticed that the woman who runs the Libs of TikTok account, who has chronicled some truly insane things, but apparently has learned nothing politically in the last few years, as I believe it was Makumi commented on the Telegram group, basically saying, well, why aren't they being thrown in prison immediately? I mean, it's just evidence of the fact that if you tie yourself in to a bourgeois political project, especially in the United States, but it's the same in Britain, all bourgeois politics offers you now, unless you are, of course, a member of the ruling class, is the opportunity to campaign for the forces of the state to be used against people you perceive as being your enemies. So for the period of the Trump administration, the American left, powered by their own cartoonish understanding of history, thought that the way that they were going to beat Trump was to basically back up James Comey and the FBI and call for Trump to be imprisoned, or his supporters to be imprisoned. And then you get the flip side of that, which is the so-called dissidents, who aren't dissidents at all, most of them, on the American right, most of whom very easily fell back into line over, well, if not over Ukraine, some of them were a little bit hesitant about that. But certainly when the really big project of American imperialism, a much more important project than Ukraine in many ways, the Israeli colony that they run, they immediately fell into line, because It's just a reflection of course, the priorities of the American ruling class and the priorities of the American state. The Ukraine project was important. It certainly was important enough to sink billions and billions of dollars into it, but it doesn't come close to the importance that the relationship, or more precisely, the colonial project known as Israel has, both from a strategic point of view, in terms of the purpose for which Israel is designed and which it fulfills to this day, and also the hold that a settler colonial project like that exerts over large elements of the US political system. Just the same way, by the way, we've been talking about France Fanon and Algeria. You look at how distorted and how chaotic the defeat in Algeria made the French Fourth Republic political system. It sent it absolutely insane because of the defeats the FLN were able to inflict upon the French armed forces, and the slow disintegration of the French armed forces over time. It basically drove the French Fourth Republic to the point where it collapsed in a military coup. A defeat for Israel in this current round of the 75-year-long war, which has been going on, a war waged on the Palestinians and on the wider Arab populations. A defeat for Israel in this will, of course, have similarly devastating consequences, I think, inside the bourgeois political system. It's a slight digression, but to go back to the whole point about the American right, all it took to get them back into line was the slightest of pressures, not even a pressure, the cracking of the whip by the American bourgeois over their Israeli colony, the playing into the decades of anti-Arab propaganda, particularly intensified, of course, after 9/11. And of course, all these supposedly dissident right-wingers turned out to be not dissident in the slightest. Fell back into line incredibly quickly, along with, of course, RFK Jr., who's now going around scritching and scratching away in interviews going, "We need to send all our nuclear weapons to Israel, and it needs to happen right now," or something along those lines. And therefore, you see, like, the so-called dissidents, like the woman who runs the Libs of TikTok account, ranting and raving away about the need to arrest everybody, throw them all in jail, treat them like the January the 6th people. It just shows you invest in bourgeois political projects, this is where you end up. You end up either like the people on the right screaming away that everything's a left-wing conspiracy, therefore you need to vote for Ron DeSantis or Trump. Or you end up like the people on the left, like Rashida Tlaib, who was regarded as one of the more principled, though that's not hard, members of the so-called squad. You end up acting like a coward. It's where you're challenged over, for instance, and this leads us into a first topic, this hospital bombing propaganda that the Israelis have been babbling on about. I've been trying to convince people about today. And Tlaib was asked about that because she put up a tweet basically blaming Israel for it, accurately so. And I'll come to this in a minute. And then, of course, the Israeli propaganda machine went into absolute overdrive when they, and I will go through the process by this happened, trying to flip the blame onto, saying that the Palestinians blew up their own hospital, we didn't do it, blah, blah, blah. And, of course, the media picked this up and run with it, and Tlaib's then challenged, and, of course, she quits and runs away, quite literally in this case. So it just goes to show, you could challenge that. I mean, this goes back to what I was saying right the way back in, back last night, when we were talking about the Israeli attack on the hospital. Like these so-called leftists, both in the Labour Party, who've now managed to usher up the courage to write a letter, but in America, like the so-called leftists, of course, all solidly behind Israel, of course, not completely verbally, but in their actions. And Tlaib doesn't even dare to come back with something that she must know about, which is the fact that Israel targets all civilians all the time and routinely lies about it. And also that this is not the first time that the Israelis have bombed a hospital. It was pointed out today that they bombed a hospital back in the 90s when they were waging a bombing campaign against Lebanon, trying to pressure Hezbollah, or trying to pressure the Lebanese population to reject Hezbollah, something which they've never managed to do, the Israelis. And they bombed a hospital then, and Perez at the time, when they were admitted to it. And they kill civilians all the time and then lie about it and lie about it and lie about it. And then a few months down the line, they will admit, oh, yeah, we did do that. When they killed the Palestinian-American journalist for Al Jazeera quite recently, they lied about it and said that she was killed by Palestinians, and lied about it and lied about it, then eventually said, oh, yeah, that was us. And so to go over the what they've been trying to do, they've been trying to say, oh, well, it couldn't possibly have been us. That it's not a bomb crater that's big enough for one of our bombs, but it's been pointed out by people who know about these things that the various munitions that are available to the Israelis that don't actually burst when they hit the ground. They're programmed to burst at a certain height. And, of course, as I said last night, the number of casualties that have been reported, it's at least 500 that's being consistently reported today, so that's the number that I'm going to go with. The Palestinians just simply don't have the munitions available to do that. And the Russian channel by the name of South Front, which has been quite reliable in its reporting on the strategic and tactical positions they're taken in the Russian war in Ukraine against NATO forces, they published a series of images and videos purporting to show a Palestinian missile which does get shot down, and it doesn't land on the hospital, it doesn't cause that explosion. Also, to recount the events that's gone on here, the Israeli forces, Israeli government, repeatedly threatened to bomb the hospital that was hit yesterday. Even The Spectator magazine, a very reactionary, in fact, rabidly reactionary magazine in Britain, their Twitter account reported that the Israelis had told not only the hospital was hit yesterday, but all the hospitals in Gaza to evacuate because they were going to bomb them. The doctors were getting phone calls telling them to evacuate because bombs were coming, and the doctors were refusing to leave. So we've got pre-established threats to the medical facilities, including the one that was hit yesterday. When it was hit, Netanyahu, the head of Netanyahu's own media team, claimed responsibility for it and said that Hamas were hiding in there, and that's why we had to hit it. This was then retracted when they started getting news about how many casualties that were being reported, and they started trying to change the story. They then, of course, published this ludicrously faked audio release today, claiming that it was an intercept between Hamas fighters discussing that the downed rocket which caused the explosion was sent up by Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And even British bourgeois pressmen like Alex Thompson, who's a complete hack on many issues, but on Palestine there seems to be some leeway on ITN, the independent television news who run Channel 4 News, to report some of the truth. And I think he's been in Palestine reporting for many years, or he's been back there repeatedly. So he went through it and said, well, look, there's no way that that's an actual genuine release. The Israelis are lying. And this is something that they've made up. And the accents in the video and in the audio are all wrong. So not only have we got the fact that they said they were going to hit it, not only have we got the fact that Netanyahu's own media people claimed responsibility for it before retracting, and then they issue a couple of different stories within 24 hours. So again, and as Max Blumenthal has pointed out, and I will refer to him, Dan Cohen and others repeatedly because they're the ones who've quite literally written the book on this stuff. This is standard operating procedure, not just for the Israelis, it's standard operating procedure for the United States as well. I said in a previous broadcast that the Obama administration, of course, hit a Médecins Sans Frontières facility in Afghanistan. They've hit medical facilities over and over again, both the Israelis and the US, in multiple different bombing campaigns. And they always deny it, and they always lie about it. They either say they didn't do it, or, well, it was actually a weapons manufacturing facility. We've got evidence, sources on the ground, satellite photos show. And this is how they operate. And who is, of course, the target of all of this? Now, the target of the Israeli disinformation campaigns that they wage, not just over this, but over everything, but over this because the reason why they panicked was not because, I think partly because of the reaction that of the Arab masses in Jordan and in Egypt and elsewhere. They may be worried a little bit about that. But the primary worry that they've got is the same worry, by the way, that the Kiev regime has, which is that it will affect opinion inside the US-led bloc. That's their real worry. They know that the Israeli government knows very well that nothing they say is going to convince the masses in the Arab world. The rulers of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar may want to believe it, but they're also constrained by the anger of the masses. The principal target of the Israeli misinformation and propaganda campaigns, just like with the Kiev regime, is, well, it's the politicians and the media people in what you would call the bourgeois public sphere inside the United States and Western Europe, principally. That's who this is targeted at, because that's who they have identified, correctly from their point of view at the moment, that they need to keep these people on side. And they need to make sure that no counter-narrative is allowed to get in to Congress in the United States. Not that it's looking like anybody is going to put forward any counter-narratives there at all. It's always been very tightly stitched up for Israel, and I think now more so than ever. But also in the British Parliament, in France, in Germany, the narrative has got to be kept very strictly under control. And that's what this is targeted at. It's designed to make sure that this atrocity they committed is thrown into doubt as much as possible. And you can see all the usual suspects in the British media, like that odious toad, Adam Bolton, former chief political correspondent for Sky News, Alison Pearson, various others going out there saying, oh, what does Israel gain from bombing a hospital? Why would they do that? And of course, they choose to ignore, or perhaps genuinely don't know, of the very long-standing Israeli strategy. And also, it's an American strategy too. Because it's not just related to bombing campaigns, it's related to the full spectrum of both high-intensity and low-intensity warfare, which is a key tactic of US imperialism and its allies and its colony in the form of Israel, is to try and exert as much pressure upon a civilian population as possible in the hope that they will turn against their leadership. Very old established tactic. You can hear, for instance, the Goblin-in-Chief, Elliot Abrams, talk about that as early as the 1980s when he's running policy against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua in the 1980s. He's on camera talking about, well, how do we split away the population of Nicaragua from the revolutionary leaders? And the answer is pressure. That's a direct quote. You can find it very easily in the interview Abrams gave at the time. And that was done by partly the violence of the ultra-violence of the Contras, the terror that they waged against the civilian population of Nicaragua, and it's partly done through siege, through sanctions. And this is true of how the Israelis have tried over and over again to damage support for Hezbollah in Lebanon. And they tried this multiple times. They tried it during an operation in the 90s called Operation Grapes of Wrath, if any of you remember that. It's one of my first really clear political memories. They tried it again during the war of 2006, which they lost. They tried bombing Beirut and other Lebanese major urban conurbations in the hope that by doing that, that they would be able to exert enough pressure that elements within the civilian population would either turn against Hezbollah or, in Lebanon's case, reignite the civil war, which I think was probably what the Israelis were after when they carried out the bombing there, to, of course, destabilize the country and therefore make Hezbollah have to refocus away from Israel. And that's a tactic that they have used repeatedly. And it's, again, sometimes the US will do it with sanctions, as in with Venezuela or Nicaragua, or in the case of Syria, they will try and use both sanctions, low-intensity warfare, and high-intensity warfare, puppet armies, that kind of thing. The aim is always get the civilian population to abandon the leadership, get the civilian population so desperate, so brutalized, that they will take anything you offer. That's what Israel does, and it's, of course, following its imperial master in the adoption of that tactic. And this is standard operating procedure. What they're doing in this initial phase of this military campaign that they are waging on Gaza is they are, first of all, they wanted to try and get the population ready to flee. And the idea was, and I think this is confirmed by the subsequent actions of both Blinken and Biden, their idea was that they were going to start a bombing campaign and then that the Americans would aid them by getting General Sisi to open the border with Egypt and allow the civilian population to flee, and then the Israelis would then move in and fight Hamas without having to deal with the difficulties of having a large civilian population there. And of course, Sisi didn't want anything to do with that proposal, and from his point of view, correctly so, because if he's seen as collaborating with what would be as the Israeli politicians themselves have said, a second Nakba, if he was seen to be collaborating with that would, at the very least, weaken his political position, and at worst mean that there would be no more President Sisi. Either he would be overthrown or dead or both. And the same was true of the King of Jordan. I have no doubt that the Americans offered all kind of inducements for basically allowing the Israelis to do a mass expulsion from probably the West Bank as well. But he had to say no, because his population would have moved against him to the point where his rule would have been endangered, if not completely destroyed. So that idea has been killed. It's been killed not because General Sisi or the King of Jordan have become any less of a selection of compradors. It's become about because both of them are sensible enough to realize that it would have meant the end of their regimes if they'd done that. And so it is the mass opposition of the Egyptian and Jordanian proletariat, the Egyptian and Jordanian masses themselves, which has defeated this plan for ethnic cleansing. It is their solidarity with the Palestinians that has prevented the Arab reactionaries from stabbing them in the back at this stage. As the PFLP have correctly identified in their documents going back to the 1960s, though, the Arab reactionaries will always sell out at the first possible opportunity. The only thing that stops them from doing that is the imminent fear of overthrow. And clearly, Sisi, who's actually got an election coming up, not that it will be a particularly fair one, but he's clearly worried about his position. And so the pressure from the streets, the pressure from the masses has prevented so far these two reactionary comprador regimes from openly betraying the Palestinians. So that idea is dead for now. The Israelis wanted to just do a mass expulsion, and that idea has been defeated, because without the collaboration of the Arab reactionaries, they can't do that. So now they've got to move to another phase of their war on the Palestinian people. And that, of course, means a great deal more difficulty for them, because they wanted to just do a mass expulsion, and then they probably wouldn't even move in then. Then they would just bomb the place with every single munition they could possibly find until they then move in. and they would only move in after they'd been convinced that they had reduced the ability of the Palestinian armed forces to resist to the point where they would suffer minimal casualties. Now it's much more difficult. Now they've had to agree to allow aid in. Again, that's not out of humanitarianism on the part of Biden or Netanyahu. It's because they were politically put in a position where they couldn't say no. Now, the Israelis have said that they reserve the right to blow any aid shipment up if they think Hamas is getting hold of it, which basically just says that they're going to blow it up, or as much of it as they can get away with. So, anything that's positive that has happened so far is as a result of the pressure of the Arab masses. Let us keep that in mind. And, of course, of pressure that's being exerted in whatever way we can in the centers of imperialism. The more we make it look politically dodgy for the likes of Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, or Biden himself to go along with this, the better it will be. But it's principally the Arab masses who will be playing the leading role in restraining the tendencies to sell out and capitulate of the reactionary regimes there. So the plan now, and as somebody commented in the Telegram group, Seymour Hersh has reported on this, is that they're going to try and basically destroy as much of Gaza as possible before moving in. And let us remind ourselves as to why they haven't gone in so far, for two principal reasons. One is that they are worried that their army isn't up to it. They're worried that they're going to get ambushed and they're going to be having heavy casualties inflicted upon them, which is why they're bombing and bombing and bombing. Not moving in so far. Apparently they said to Biden today, Netanyahu said to Biden, that a ground operation is inevitable. So they have apparently had their final cabinet meeting that would decide upon the operation. Now, what they seem to be hinting at, and what I think that they will do, I think that they're not going to try and take the whole place. That would be too much. Their ambitions will be more limited. I think that they're going to try and take some of the Gaza Strip and then try and declare that like a new security zone or something and declare victory. That's what they want. I think that's what the bargaining that was going on, that may be what the bargaining that was going on between Blinken and Netanyahu, which is how much does Netanyahu need to save his own skin, which is all he's really concerned about, by the way. And stay out of prison. That's his other concern. And so I think that the Israeli military commanders, being obviously more aware of the limitations of the Israeli forces than the politicians are, have told them that if they do go in, they're going to get ambushed and they're going to suffer heavy casualties. We may be looking at they will now be looking at a smaller incursion than previously fought, that will stop at a certain point and Netanyahu will declare victory when he's reached the minimum territory and get territorial gain and deaths that he can claim and look as if he's a winner. But of course this isn't going to work. He's already lost. He lost as soon as the Palestinian fighters broke through that fence. And the other news that emerged today was, of course, that the casualties from the fighting weren't, as according to Haaretz anyway, the established casualties so far are numbering 300 to 400, not over 1,000 as was previously claimed. Again, like what you will find is that every single wild claim that the Israelis and the US imperialists and their puppets in the bourgeois press have made will turn out to be either an outright lie or a wild exaggeration. And so with the death toll, it's going to be a wild exaggeration. It's going to be, 300 to 500 possibly, and I will say now that the overwhelming majority of it will be military, police, or intelligence men. That's who it will turn out have mostly been killed. And there will, of course, be civilian casualties, but nothing like on the scale that was reported. And that will be admitted. It's already being admitted, to be fair, in places like Haaretz, which nobody quotes in the British bourgeois press. People like Piers Morgan, I seriously doubt he would even know what it is. Um, so the Israeli military operation already delayed, and because they have delayed so long, and are now looking weaker and weaker. I think that the longer it gets delayed, the less ambitious it will be, because clearly the lunatics in the Israeli cabinet started screaming immediately they had to go in and march all the way to the sea and take the whole of Gaza. And then they've spent the last several days arguing amongst themselves as to how far they can go. So they will try and use all the big explosive devices they possibly can, all the deadly munitions that the Americans can supply them with, and the Europeans, of course, to essentially create a bloody fireworks display over Gaza, commit as many brutalities as they possibly can, in order that a large death toll can be served up to the salivating Kahanist base of Netanyahu. Now, this, of course, might not help them at all when they do launch their ground operation. Presumably, I think it's fairly well established, actually, the Palestinian armed forces have been planning for this and are still in position and will be waiting for the Israeli ground forces when they do come in, which is why they've delayed so long. And it's sort of worth reminding ourselves that the Yeltsin era Russian armed forces, who were a mess, by the way, but they still had all the enormous firepower, or a large chunk of it, that the old Soviet army had. They had, gigantic amounts of artillery and multiple launch rocket systems. They had complete air supremacy when they went to fight the Chechens in 1994. And what the Yeltsin-led army did was, of course, they used this advantage. They completely leveled Grozny in 1994. It looked like a moonscape. Again, I can sort of remember this being covered at the time. Looking back at the coverage now, the BBC was somewhat conflicted because they wanted to back Yeltsin, but they also wanted to ensure that the Russian state disintegrated further. So a very conflicted time for the bourgeois press. But the Russian forces then completely leveled Grozny. They turned like large areas of it just looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. And they used all the very impressive high explosive devices that they could possibly find, and it didn't work. Because, of course, then they sent their armored columns into Grozny, and the Chechens ran out from the basements where they'd been hiding in. And I remember reading one account there where they would take out the lead tank, take out the rear tank, and kill everybody in the middle. And it went so badly, and of course the Russians were so abominably led by not only Yeltsin, but some totally corrupt, totally useless senior officers in the Russian armed forces at the time, that they ended up losing that war. It was a complete disaster. So leveling a place, completely leveling it, which is what the Israelis are trying to do with Gaza, doesn't necessarily guarantee that you will be able to actually take it, especially not if your opponent has spent years digging in. So the tactic the Israelis are using here is not guaranteed to bring them any degree of success. And again, like the sickening thing is, of course, that all of this is principally, of course, to secure the continued existence of a settler colonial project, which is, of course, what is going on here, but on a narrower scale, that it's designed to save the bacon of Netanyahu. And, of course, that's not going to work either. We went into last night why long, even medium term, the Israeli state is probably finished. And so my prediction on that remains. We will see how things pan out. Now, of course, there is the question of the northern front and what is going on up there. The Hezbollah forces continue daily exchanges of fire with the Israelis. There was an interview given by Scott Ritter recently, yesterday actually, on the Judge Napolitano channel, where he was talking about the idea that Hezbollah, if they chose to go on the offensive, could easily cut through the Israeli forces in the north. Now, I had some doubts about this because I always assume, perhaps wrongly, and others have pointed me to different sources where different assessments of Hezbollah's strength are available. My assumption, my working assumption, was that in the north, that Hezbollah had an incredibly strong defensive position, which the Israelis couldn't get through in 2006. And it's only strengthened since then. And that's why the Israelis won't attack on the ground. But I didn't think that they had the capability of doing what Ritter was saying that they could do. Others have pointed out and responded to my comment on that, and I thank them for it, that Hezbollah showed during the war in Syria that they had mobile offensive capabilities and could move quite quickly to take territory. And so that's an interesting angle on this, that Hezbollah's capacities of mobile warfare have improved considerably over the years, and they've gained a great deal of combat experience fighting the US and Israeli proxies on the ground in Syria. So, and it was a very interesting article that was sent to me that was done by the very experienced war correspondent Elijah Manier, who writes a lot for his own, writes a lot for WordPress. He's on Press TV a lot, detailing some of these actions that Hezbollah fighters have been involved in. So this leads us then to a couple of interesting comments made by Putin, because as Jay pointed out in his opening comment, the Americans are sending more armed forces up to, in the form of naval battle groups, to the Mediterranean. Now, Putin, at his press conference at the Belt and Road summit that was held just earlier, a couple of days ago, actually, he was commenting upon the supply of the ATACMS missile system to the Kiev regime. And he said something very interesting, which I think has two elements to it, and I'll cover this in a moment, what those elements are. I'm quoting Putin directly here from the translation of his comments that's on the Kremlin website. Quote reads as follows: "They have upped and dragged 2 carrier groups to the Mediterranean. I want to say, what I am going to say and inform you about is not a threat. That I have instructed the Russian aerospace forces to start patrolling the neutral zone over the Black Sea on a permanent basis. Our MiG-31 aircraft carry the Kinzhal system that, as is common knowledge, have a range of over 1,000 kilometers and can reach speeds of up to Mach 9. Now, he followed up with another comment later on in the press conference, just before he concluded, where he said, "I emphasize that this is not a threat, but we will perform visual combat and weapons-based control over what is happening." So, with the Americans sending 2 aircraft carrier battle groups to the Eastern Mediterranean, and of course supplying this missile system to the Kiev regime, which can of course hit targets inside the Russian Federation, perhaps quite deep inside the Russian Federation. So Putin responds, and he responds by saying, quite simply, well, we've got a superior missile system in the form of the Kinzhal missile, which is a hypersonic missile, and it has a range of over 1,000 kilometers. So if you look at a map of the Black Sea area and the neutral area where the Russians have, by international conventions, the right to fly their aircraft around, and if they patrol around there, they can, with that missile system, potentially hit the American aircraft carrier groups that are going to be in the Eastern Mediterranean, because they have that 1,000-kilometer range. And according to those who have the knowledge of these things, the Kinzhal system can't be stopped by any anti-missile system that the American Navy has available to it can't stop that Russian missile. So why is Putin saying that? Well, of course, in the most direct response, he's coming back to Biden and saying, okay, you supply the ATACMS missile, you want to hit things in Russia. Well, if you start doing that, we can hit your ships that are now in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's a direct comeback to that, is the most clear and obvious point. The second part of it, though, is the wider discussion over, well, where does this go? Because at the moment, of course, things haven't got to the point where, open warfare has broken out, but on a wider sense, even though it is escalating on the Lebanese and occupied Palestine border. Now, one of the things that's been talked about by various commentators in the United States is about what could be the purpose of putting these carriers in the Eastern Mediterranean. Is it to try and target the allies of the Palestinians? This is the most obvious thing. This, of course, is what Biden, or more appropriately, Lloyd Austin, was driving at when Biden said, "I got one word for you: don't." He was making a direct threat to Hezbollah and ultimately to Iran and Syria not to intervene in support of Gaza when the Israelis launch their ground operation, if indeed they do, because there's still some doubts at time of broadcast here as to whether they're going to. So, are they then planning to attack what? Are they planning to attack Hezbollah? Are they planning to attack Syria? Are they planning to attack both? Because as Elijah Manier notes in the article I was mentioning just a moment ago, and this is an article from 2017, and this is a detail I didn't know about, they have, the Syrians that is, been building an underground movement inside the occupied Golan Heights for a number of years now, in preparation for the moment when their reconquest of their territory inside Syria is either complete or near to completion, or that the defense of Syria requires the opening up of a military operation inside the Golan to attack Israeli forces there directly. So that's an interesting development. And also, though, if the Israelis then go after the Syrian government directly, well, that would cross an uncrossable line for the Russians. The Russian government has worked incredibly hard to aid the Syrian government led by Bashar al-Assad, and they are not prepared to let their ally come under unrestricted attack by the Israelis without striking back. Now, they can strike back in a number of ways, of course. They can enable the S-300 system they can give the Syrians the all clear and allow that system to target Israeli warplanes in a way that, which would of course be effective at shooting a number of them down. They could of course supply the Syrians, if they haven't already, with the S-400 system, which is even more advanced of course, and start targeting Israeli warplanes. That would of course give Netanyahu extreme pause for thought. And ultimately, if the Americans insist on doing something incredibly aggressive and incredibly stupid, such as launching attacks on Syria using planes from the aircraft carrier battle groups in the Eastern Mediterranean, well, Putin's making it clear that the Russians have a potentially devastating response to that. Now, of course, that will not be a threat that he's just made in a press conference. I am fairly certain that that threat will have been because it is a threat, even though Putin's saying that it's not, that, or maybe it's a promise, will have been sent through the usual channels, military to military communication, I'm sure, to the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. from the Russian General Staff. Basically saying, if you go after our ally in Syria, then, well, we will have to go after you. Because there's no way the Russians, as I said, having spent so much time and energy and resources, both human and economic, in securing the victory in Syria, that they're going to allow the whole thing to be blown up by the United States now. So that's where things potentially are drifting towards, and that's a couple of interesting comments that Putin was making there. He also said a couple of interesting things with regard to the situation in Ukraine. He basically said on the supply of the ATACMS missile, he said, well, why on earth are they still bothering? All they're doing now is prolonging the agony of the Ukrainian people. And he's absolutely right about that. There's the Ukrainian regime has nothing left to give now. This whatever happens in the Middle East now, attention is all on that. The Americans don't want to openly give up, but the Russians are moving inexorably into place to do perhaps the finish this operation in spring to summer of 2024. That seems to be the deadline, if indeed there is one that they are talking about. And of course, it will end purely on the Russians' terms now, which makes, of course, the behavior of US imperialism towards Israel ever more hardline and ever more desperate. They know they've lost in Ukraine. They know that they have massively underestimated the strength of the Russian economic and political system. They always were afraid of the Russian military in Ukraine, which is why they never deployed the amount of resources that they potentially could have done. They never risked a direct open confrontation. They were fairly sure that the sanctions regime was going to affect the Russians, but they hoped it would, to the point where the Putin government got destabilized, but of course it never did, or certainly not to the extent that they would have wanted. And now we are looking at a situation where, due to the escalating crisis and escalating instability in the derivatives market, it could be the case that those economies, such as the Russians, which have been cut off from Western systems, are going to survive what I'm going to call a renewal of the 2008 crisis far better than anybody in the West. Now, I will come back to the questions over the derivatives market and what that means in a show to be done probably on Saturday, by the time I've got round to completing all the reading I need to do for that. So, other things coming out of the Belt and Road Initiative forum out in China. New grain deal between Russia and China, which of course is far more extensive than any markets that the Russians might have lost. Putin confirming that Russia was moving up the ranks of trading partners with China to, of course, still not near the position that the American imperialists still have themselves, but coming much closer to it. And of course, the American imperialists continue their extended freak out about the fact that that the Chinese system still relentlessly refuses to fall apart on the command of an economist editorial. Numerous people have posted all the times that The Economist in particular, which is this ridiculous reactionary rag in Britain that routinely gets things wrong. It's just basically a sort of wish list for the British bourgeoisie. We were encouraged to read it as undergraduates, by the way, which just goes to show how completely degenerated political science and political economy are as undergraduate courses in Britain. They recommend that you read The Economist, for fuck's sake. Financial Times, I could understand. It still has some degree of accuracy in its reporting, but Jesus, The Economist? My God. But The Economist has predicted on so many occasions that it's the end of China since 1990 that you would think that they would get tired of being wrong. And I think at each time they have predicted this, they've usually sourced it from like one disgruntled Chinese exile or another. And it shows really that they've got the same level of fundamental misunderstanding of the Chinese economy as they made a fundamental mistake about the Russian economy, which goes to show that like they really have made some very severe errors in how they have assessed these things. And you got to wonder, like, what the hell goes on in these intelligence agencies that they're not able to do quite basic things, such as find English translations of Chinese government documents and read them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I am going to circle around to that long-promised programs on China at some point very soon. Of course, events being what they are, I may have to keep juggling now. So, I'll just pause now for comments, because quite a few have come through. Right. Okay, hello to Zim Left Radio, and hello to Carolus Maximus and Brian Gillespie. Banana Bender says, seeing the right go from anti-globalist rhetoric to straight-up supporting Israel is frighteningly quick. I have whiplash. Yeah, well, I think that the thing to bear in mind, and we've mentioned this before, but there's a very instructive thing which you can do, which is go back and watch good old Pat Buchanan's 92 Republican convention speech, where he basically says all the same things that Trump is saying, but, more intelligently. And what you'll find is that the right and the activist base on the right in America have been saying like many of the same things for decades, but they always fall back into just a knee-jerk support of all the usual nostrums, because these people never move beyond the paradigm of, well, the furthest they'll ever go is like 1992 era Pat Buchanan, and they certainly won't go near him when it comes to his criticisms of Israel. And the same is true now. They'll come up with these they'll adopt like various different memes about the globalists from Twitter. They'll start talking about bringing manufacturing back to the American heartland. They'll start talking about Josh Hawley's rabid fantasies of some kind of like Italian-style Catholic Christian democracy being brought to the United States, which is a complete non-starter. I mean, talk about fantasies. Like the Catholic right, the Catholic so-called social right in the United States have an even worse indulgence of complete fantasy than the American left do. The American left who still want everybody to believe that the return of social democracy is possible. The American right think that the rebirth of Christian democracy is on the horizon because what? What are they basing that on? They, of course, don't want to admit that the Christian democracy that was possible in Italy, which is some of what Hawley is basing his article on, was only possible because of concessions that needed to be made by US imperialism and its vassals to the working class and, to a certain extent, the petty bourgeoisie, to stave off the potential the increasing popularity of communism. And without that threat, of course, that all goes away. And all those political projects that were linked to the Bolshevik Revolution and its success have all gone away as well. So Josh Hawley might like to noodle away in the pages of Compact, but what he's putting forward is just as much of a fantasy as the program of Bernie Sanders. It's just got a pope attached to it. Right. Hello to Philbin. Brian says, my union branch leadership couldn't contain themselves from proposing resolutions condemning the special military operation back in March 22. About the recent events in Gaza, not a word. Well, it's funny how brave some union bureaucrats get when they are in line with imperialism. They can be really brave when the ruling class agrees with everything you say. Banana Bender says, Rebel News are the main one. They supported the Canadian truckers and were anti-vax. Now they're hardcore Zionists. Yeah, it's funny how they've forgotten how apeshit Benjamin Netanyahu went for the COVID regime. He loved that shit. He even stirred up opposition inside his own base. He went so far with it. All that's forgotten now because, of course, with the cracking of the whip comes the petty bourgeoisie falling into line. And Israel is like the big project, the big colonial project, as I say many times, for the American bourgeoisie. And it's much, much more important than any of these other priorities, which the so-called dissident right is allowed to noodle away over. They're not allowed to fuck around when it comes to the most important things that really matter to the American ruling class. And that matters way more than the profits of the pharmaceutical industry or any of the other priorities that the American capitalist class has. Preserving the strategic position in the Middle East and, of course, the colonial project matters more than anything else right now, as Zelensky has discovered to his cost. Right. Good afternoon to Kent in Minneapolis. Philbin says, both the IDF and US Air Force make a habit of targeting civilians, including medical facilities. This gaslighting spin, being caught posting a fake video, damns the IDF. They're on overdrive. Yep. Yuan points out Clinton bombed a pharmaceutical factory in Sudan. He did indeed, and did it to get over the Lewinsky scandal. Good evening to Mike Martinez. Ash says, in a hilarious interview with Bassem Youssef on Uncensored, Piers Morgan agreed the Israeli campaign is to cause a rift in support for Hamas, but refused to accept that it's the same as ISIS tactics. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing you get with like these bloviating reactionaries. They're like the characters that write for Spiked magazine. They'll thump on the table and scream about the need to confront the head choppers. But apparently, cutting someone's head off with a sword is worse than cutting 20 people's head off with a high explosive device, with a 1,000-pound bomb or whatever the fuck it is, by collapsing an apartment block on their heads. That apparently is civilized. Using a sword to cut off somebody's head, that is uncivilized. These are the rules that you've got to learn. I mean, I feel like we're going into a George Carlin routine here, where the old line that he used back in his special in the 80s, where he said, Israeli terrorists are called commandos, Palestinian commandos are called terrorists. I mean, it's a joke, but it's true. I mean, this is how ridiculous these people are. You get people like Brendan O'Neill, this moronic ex-Trotskyite reactionary who writes for Spiked, fulminating away about Western values whilst enthusiastically supporting like the carpet bombing of a civilian population, because that's what civilized people do. Fuck off, seriously. All of these people are just ridiculous. But by the way, like, it makes me laugh when you get Netanyahu saying Hamas is the same as ISIS. Israel aided ISIS. I mean, it's not even that difficult to track this down. The only time ISIS fighters ever fired upon the Israelis, they went up to them and said, sorry, we mistook you for somebody else. And there's photos of them like hanging out with the IDF and having a laugh with them on the Golan border. So, and there's of course the other story about, it was reported in the Daily Mail of all places, that Israel transferred wounded jihadist fighters out of Syria into Israeli medical facilities because the Israelis were invested in the war to remove Assad, because of course they fear, as they've always feared, Arab nationalism in the form of Baathism, a much more than they ever feared, like the likes of Al-Qaeda, who have never seriously gone after Israel as far as I can tell, because they've always been a creation of imperialism. And they're very much, of course, want to get rid of Assad because of his association with the legacy of revolutionary Arab nationalism, and of course the fact that he's a strong ally of Iran. That was their absolute priority, and they were more than happy to side with ISIS in trying to achieve that. Thankfully, they didn't. Right. Philbin says, Democrat Congressman Brad Sherman recently proposed as a unity candidate for the vacant speaker post George W. Bush. He was not joking. Of course he wasn't. They loved George W. Bush because he was charming and said goofy things. And, yeah, he killed 1 million people, but, he didn't say rude things about Hillary Clinton. It was literally the standard the Democratic Party uses. Is there any possibility in the near future that the White House will drop Israel? What would it take? Interesting question. Either a revolt inside the United States itself that would make continued support for Israel unviable and unprofitable, or military disasters escalating to the point where the US needed to essentially redeploy its forces away from defending Israel, or economic disaster to the point where supporting the Israeli colony became impossible. So revolt at home, economic catastrophe, or military disasters elsewhere in the world, or a combination of the above. It will happen at some point. It's just that at the moment they have decided to double down in support for Israel because of the disaster in Ukraine. As things unfold, and if this escalating crisis in the bond markets turns into a real economic disaster, then we may need to revisit things. The other possibility, of course, is that the US doesn't abandon Israel, but Israel itself implodes domestically. That's another possibility which we should take seriously. W recently felt emboldened enough to publicly advocate for a military response from the US to Hamas. Well, of course he does, because he's been completely rehabilitated by the liberals. He was in hiding for a long time because of the disasters that accompanied his presidency. But after he's been completely redeemed by first the Republican Party establishment and then by the American liberal left, well, he feels free to walk around and say whatever the fuck he likes now. And they were portraying him as a charming retired watercolor artist. Why wouldn't he be confident in coming back? News updates. Apparently, this is from Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk. Police have broken up a big pro-Palestine protest in Berlin, on the orders of Schultz directly, I don't doubt. After that loser had to eat the tarmac at the Tel Aviv airport yesterday. Yeah, the German ruling class get ever more reactionary. I mean, I'm going to try and book in an interview with a German comrade coming up quite soon to cover this in more depth. Irish Partisan says Palestinian Christian leaders from the Greek Orthodox, Latin and Episcopalian churches have condemned the Israeli attacks on Gaza. Again, I mean, to repeat some of what we said last night, the Christian leaders have all the reason to be against the Israeli regime. The more time goes on, the more the Israeli fanatical fascist elements will try to stop Christian access to the holiest sites in Christianity. And they've already been harassing not just Christians from Palestine, but Christians from overseas. And nothing from the big-time Christians in the United States about that yet, because their only real biblical commitment is their very real biblical obsession with supporting U.S. imperialism. However, it may be worth making that point to individual Christians who are more open-minded about this. The Christian leaders in the United States are just despicable reactionaries. People who just average churchgoers, though, may be interested in learning this. So it should be, that truth should be brought to them. Apparently the IDF have announced attacks on Lebanese territory again. Yeah, diversify your assets by buying up Russian rubles and Chinese yuan. Yes, anybody who got some assets out there, invest in rubles and yuan. Seems to be the winner in the future. Maybe buy up some Iranian currency. I'm actually being serious about that. Israeli foreign minister has hinted at taking parts of Gaza. Yeah. Whether they'll be able to do it, that's another question entirely. Okay, apparently the economist Michael Roberts has done a very good summary of the Israeli economy with historical context. I haven't checked that out yet. I will be sure to do so. Morgan says, war monitors reporting an Israeli airstrike on Syrian army positions. Yeah, this... At what point does Assad, if he hasn't, I'm sure maybe he has done already, turn to Putin and say, well, look, we can't have it carry on this way. We can't have our army repeatedly attacked by the Israelis. You've got to let us use the S-300 system against them. How long is it going to be that the Russians refuse them? I don't think it's going to be too much longer, to be completely honest. If Putin's now openly floating the possibility of blowing the American aircraft carriers out of the water using a hypersonic missile, shooting some Israeli aircraft down using the S-300 systems that they've given to the Syrians, this can't be far behind now. Sooner or later, Assad's insistence that they need to be able to use these is going to have to be heard by the Kremlin, and they're going to have to give them permission to do it. Because otherwise, the Israelis will keep doing this and keep doing this to the point where the Russian alliance with the Syrians begins to fray, which is what the Israelis want. And I don't think that Putin might have tried his best to try and build some kind of alliance with the Israelis, but that's gone now. I mean, as always with the Russian government, it operates, I think, by Putin being basically the chairman of a extended group that has to reach some sort of consensus. According to John Helmer, author of the very interesting, always interesting blog Dances with Bears, who of course has vast contacts inside Russia and was apparently forced out of Russia by the death threats coming from an oligarch. But he obviously has a great deal of knowledge about the situation. In reporting he's done, the Russian military establishment, the high command and the intelligence men, have been reporting for many, many months, if not years, to the Russian politicians, including Putin, of course, that Israel should be considered to be a hostile state. Now, Putin so far hasn't reached the point where the political side of the Russian Federation, led by him, is prepared to accept that. But if they keep on attacking important Russian allies, then he will have to accept that at some point soon. Because to go back to Putin's presence at the Belt and Road Conference and all the business they're building up with in Central Asia through their own Eurasian Economic Union, all the business they're doing with Iran, the importance of the relationship with Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian government, all of that outweighs whatever attempts that the pro-Zionist sections of the Russian government wanted to make to build up a relationship with Israel. And of course, many of the Russians who've frequented Israel have gone home again or have gone elsewhere. So we are going to get to the point where the Russian government has to make a decision. And it is the same process that they have gone through with regard to all the European countries. Putin's, not just Putin's, but the Russian ruling class's profitable relationship with the German ruling class has been brought to an end. And so eventually their relationship with the Israeli ruling class is going to be brought to an end. And the Syrians are going to get their wish to be able to shoot down these Israeli aircraft at some point soon. Because, again, like the Russian politicians are going to have to accept that whatever overtures that they have made to the Israeli government, whatever business they thought they had, whatever relationship they thought they were building up, it's gone. It's gone because the world is fracturing, the alliances are being confirmed, and there's no stronger bond that exists than between a colony and its master. And that is the nature of Israel that has now been starkly revealed. And it's a truth that the Russian leadership will now have to accommodate themselves with. And they'll have to accommodate the fact that their ally, in the form of the Syrian government, is not going to tolerate their army being bombed indiscriminately by the Israeli Air Force. They're either going to have to enable them to target them with the air defense system, or provide them, the Syrians, with more aircraft that can go up in the air and act as interceptors. So, yeah, the attempts of the Russian ruling class to build a lasting relationship with Israel are coming to a close. And they will come to a close quite soon, I think. Right. Other things I wanted to mention. Before that, I will just drop in a couple of other comments here. Burke says, so disgusted with Owen Jones, Navarro, and the rest of the British so-called left of media today, unable to say it was the Israelis that bombed the hospital. Yeah, because, again, like this happened all the way through this is the Corbyn saga replayed. Like, whenever the Israelis or their allies in Britain went hysterical and whipped up another propaganda storm, what happened? The Navarra media types, the Owen Jones types, all cringed and ran away. Why? Because ultimately this is about class interests, their class interests. They're a petty bourgeois layer whose income is dependent upon their access to the bourgeois press. Jones especially is a direct employee of the bourgeois press. He doesn't want to go too far in offending the sensibilities of the supporters of Israel, the rabid supporters of Israel that work for The Guardian. The Novara crew are a bunch of pathetic political weaklings, or maybe, agents of the state, who knows. But let's just assume for the purposes of being charitable that they're just pathetic, petty bourgeois political weaklings. Any pressure that comes on them from the ruling class in the smallest way will send them running for the hills. And this was true all the way through the Corbyn period. Bastani is the worst, by the way, because Michael Walker is just a complete fool and a reactionary. Ash Sarkar is an absolute opportunist of the lowest possible kind. Bastani knows better. I think he knows the reality, but he gives into the propaganda of the bourgeoisie anyway. Because again, he's safeguarding his place, they all are, as the in-house left for the British ruling class. That's what they're doing. They like their fake fights. They like to go on GB News and have a fake fight with, Lawrence Fox, maybe not him anymore, whoever the fuck else they've got on there, some rent-a-gob moron from Spikes magazine, and they want to have a row about pronouns, and they want to have a row about, allowing Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs access to a women's-only prison or something, and they want to have a fake fight about that, and then they want to go home and feel really good about themselves. They don't want to, just as the same with over the Ukraine thing, they're prepared to have a conscience as long as British imperialism doesn't crack the whip on them. As soon as that comes down, their conscience disappears, and it's, I don't know, cool, Hamas, propaganda, I don't know, and then they'll hope to move it on to something else. And then, of course, months later, when the Israelis admit that they did it, it'll never get mentioned. Okay. Right, I'm going to go on to final item on the agenda, which is a bit of a diversion from, or a divergence, shall we say, from where we've been, which is, of course, returning to the subject that's been brought up before in the discussion group of the referendum recently that was held in Australia over something called The Voice, which sounds like an awful corporate slogan, and in fact it is. And this is, of course, a proposal that came from the Australian government, led by Albanese, with the idea that they were going to alter the Australian Constitution, which was, of course, the act which founded the Australia as a nation state all the way back in, I believe it was 1901. And the idea was that they're going to be forming a body of some kind that was going to provide permanent political representation to the native Australian, the Aboriginal population. And this was put to a referendum, which was held on the 14th, and the result was basically a 60-40 in the no direction. The Australian petty bourgeois left immediately, of course, had a meltdown, declaring that this was all the act of a bunch of working class racists, and this was all terrible, and this was proof that Australia was ruled by the worst kind of whites only kind of people, and it was a return to Australian apartheid, that kind of thing. So you can imagine the response, or perhaps you don't need to imagine the response. So I wanted to look at this as an example of how the minority nationalities, shall we say, or oppressed nations that exist or are said to exist within existing nation states are treated. Should say, though, that of course it was by no means the case that that all of the voters who rejected this were, of course, right-wing racists. This is, of course, a cliche drawn upon by the petty bourgeois left in Australia. There was a very clear Marxist critique to be made of the proposals that the Albanese government made regarding The Voice. Now, what was actually being proposed, far from what the Australian left seemed to like to pretend that it was actually much more to do with setting up some kind of like what in British terms we'd call some sort of quango or non-departmental public body. Basically, it's like a bureaucratic entity that would be then said to be representing Australian Indigenous voices. Now, there is a very thorough critique of this, which is done by the Australian Communist Party, entitled "In Defence of the Militant No Vote" by an Australian communist by the name of Dan Kelly. I don't know who that is, but he is to be credited with writing a very exhaustive critique of the government's proposal that I think does expose it for the fraud that it is. And in that, Kelly, the writer, points out that the idea of this Indigenous representational body goes back actually to the days of John Howard. And if you don't know who John Howard is, he's the arch-reactionary Liberal National Prime Minister who ruled for a very long time between, I think, the mid-1990s to the late 2000s, when the enormously ineffective, completely useless governments of Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard took over. So this is an old idea, and it comes from like an arch-reactionary period in the John Howard period, and the idea being that they would set up some kind of representational body that would be then said to be the voice for Indigenous Australian affairs, or be their representation, and that this would then essentially act as essentially a rubber stamp for the Australian government, and that it would then be used to say, well, look, the official voice of the Australian Indigenous population, this voice that we've given them, has approved of policy X, Y, or Z, and therefore we can go ahead with it. The Indigenous representation has agreed. Now, the cynical manipulations here are quite obvious, which is that they've got in Australia a case where you have the Indigenous population who do constitute a genuinely oppressed minority within Australian society. I don't think that's doubted by anybody now, anybody reasonable at least. And there are some certain statistics which I've taken these directly from the Australian government's own websites. So here I'm just going to read off a few things to demonstrate the fact that the Aboriginal population in Australia suffers from an extremely negative position, worse even than the poorer end of the rest of the Australian working class. So the rate of poverty for Aboriginals is 19.3% in Australia, compared with 12.4% of the rest of Australians. Other estimates, I mean, I saw two estimates of the rate of poverty for the Aboriginal population. Some say it's 19.3. There are others that say it's 30% of all Aboriginal households live in poverty. The Aboriginal unemployment rate is at least 19%. The number of Aboriginal teenagers not in education or training is 3 times higher than other Australians. 70% of those Aboriginals aged 20 to 24 are not in education or employment. That would be in British terms the group known as NEETs, not in education, employment or training. 50% of Aboriginal adults are on some form of welfare payment. 15% of young Aboriginal women are on the Australian single parent payment. The life expectancy for Aboriginal Australians is 20 years below the Australian average life expectancy of 84. So that's 64 years old. And there's, of course, massive and very well documented problems with alcohol and drug abuse in Australian Aboriginal communities. So with all of that outlined, and again, I'm taking that directly from Australian government statistics, and so it can't be doubted that in class terms, Aboriginal Australians are in a position where they are at the very lowest end of the working class, if not fallen into the straight or the lowest or the lower end of even the lumpen proletariat. Where now, of course, that is not uniform. They are, as a group, more likely to be in positions of extreme poverty with all that brings with it. But there are, of course, class layers to the Aboriginal population, as there are with the Maoris in New Zealand, the Native Americans in the United States, or the natives in the native population in Canada. There are different class layers in all of these populations. And so there will be, and indeed there is, an Aboriginal capitalist class in Australia, a certain layer that would correspond to the petty bourgeoisie. So it's not uniform poverty across the board, but it is that it is certain that they are subjected to much higher rates of poverty than other Australians. And so what, as Kelly outlined in his critique, and as also was mentioned in articles on the World Socialist website, who did a decent analysis. I think the analysis done by the Australian communists that I posted is more thorough and comprehensive. What the Australian government of Albanese did was that they created a basically fake consultation process whereby to form this policy. They wanted to make it look as if they were consulting with Aboriginal communities, but what they wanted to have was their own people, their own political appointees in charge of that consultation process at each stage, to make sure that what was delivered and what was to be the policy was basically what Albanese and his crew had in mind anyway. And so what the Australian communists rightly point out is that at each stage, various Aboriginal groups were making other proposals in this policy-making process that would have either provided for what is referred to as a treaty. Now, I would need to read up more on this, but I think that what the objections of people like the former Green senator, who's an Aboriginal woman called Lydia Thorpe, what she was objecting to was the idea that there should be a treaty signed between the Aboriginal population and the Australian government. And I believe that this is a reference to the treaties that have been signed between the New Zealand Maori and the New Zealand government, and that these date back in New Zealand back into the 19th century. Again, New Zealand viewers and listeners may want to correct me on this, but because I only read a little bit about this. But I think what happened in New Zealand was that the Maori were able to actually do some damage to the British occupation authorities, to the point, militarily speaking, where the British thought it would be better to cut a deal with them. And as a result, even though they suffered from colonization and occupation, the Maori in New Zealand are in a slightly better position than the Aborigines in Australia are, where there never was any kind of treaty signed, where they were just shoved into this new Australian state that was formed over 120 years ago. And then they were subject to a very vicious regime of institutionalized racism ever since then. And of course, I remember reading John Pilger's book about his early days as a young reporter in Australia, about how the Australian government was literally running an apartheid policy on the same lines as white South Africa was, on the same lines as the Deep South in the United States of America was. Now, I didn't know that until I read that book, his book Hidden Agendas, 20 years ago. And so clearly this population has suffered from an enormous amount of institutionalized racialist policies, a great deal of state violence, and ingrained poverty to this day. Now, the question that should be asked is, well, is the proposal of the Albanese government going to address any of that? And the answer from everything I've read about it has to be no. What Albanese wanted to do is the same thing that John Howard wanted to do and that even Tony Abbott wanted to do, which is set up a body which will essentially be controlled by the existing Australian political structures, because the formation of this, as I've said already, as the Australian communists note in their critique, where the formation of the policy was completely controlled by political appointees of the existing Australian political authorities, and that they were designing a process which would be wholly under their control, that was going to end up with people in whatever representative body they eventually came up with, that would be, of course, easy to manipulate and easy to bring into line if they needed to. And that is exactly the political practice that con men like Albanese specialise in. There is no way that the Australian capitalist class was ever going to agree, never mind promote anything that could seriously get in the way of things they want to do. If they want to dispossess Aboriginals off whatever land they have left to, I don't know, dig another uranium mine or gold mine or develop an area, then they don't want to have some body in the way, or some elected or representative body that could throw any spanners into the works. What they want is something which is going to be staffed by political appointees, members of the Aboriginal bourgeois, and of course dull-witted academics who will make long-winded speeches about land recognition claims and never actually do anything. And that's what they were doing, which is why, as not just the article from the communists, but also some other articles chronicling the Albanese government's tactics when it came to the referendum campaign, it was all run on vibes. And I read, because there's, by the way, there's two Australian communist parties. There's the one whose link I've posted up there in the chat, and there's an Khrushchevite revisionist one who endorsed this ridiculous farce. Now, what the Yes campaign has specialised in is basically running on vibes, it seems. That's what the Australian communists say. They were basically running around saying, oh, you've got to vote yes, it's going to improve the lives of the Aboriginal population. They don't say how. So it was all about showing that, well, not showing, but trying to give an impression of something. And so, not surprisingly, it failed and fell apart. And as I said, like, this is not a surprise. They were never going to allow anything that got in the way of capital accumulation. The Australian ruling class don't want something that could get in the way of them doing to the population, the Aboriginal population, whatever the hell capital demanded at the time. And so, again, like, not a surprise that this didn't inspire anybody, that this turned into basically a joke, and it was being promoted by, like, some of the worst elements in the political system of Australia. Now, the No campaign was nominally led by Peter Dutton, who is this sort of arch-reactionary figure who's in charge of the Australian Liberal Party. So the official No campaign wasn't any good either, but what they were proposing was basically just an uninspiring bureaucratic entity, and I don't think would do anything to improve the lot of the vast bulk of the Aboriginal population. So the question then comes up as to, like, well, what attitude should communists take to these things when they arise? I think that the Australian communists whose link I've posted there have largely got this right, which is that you certainly should campaign for the improvements to the lives of Aboriginals, who are the most oppressed and repressed elements in the Australian capitalist state. But also, at the same time, you have to bear in mind that the Australian state right now isn't capable of delivering, Australian capitalism isn't capable of delivering any kind of improvements even to the lives of the broader Australian working class, never mind the most oppressed elements within it. And so this brings up the question of, well, in a campaign for, or should we say, in building support for a communist party, a communist movement in Australia, how should the question of the indigenous population be approached? And I think here you've got to do two things. You've got to try and unify the struggles of the Aboriginal population with the rest of the Australian working class. You might say no easy thing, but I think that is something that you do have to do. But also you have to look at the claims to, or the, should we say, the rights of the Aboriginal population to the preservation of their culture, their language, their beliefs, all the things that constitute them as a group, which have been routinely trampled all over by the Australian capitalist class. And of course, then you have to raise their standard of living and target in a very specific way the extreme poverty that this group lives in, to raise it to the level of the rest of the working class, to eliminate the centuries-long bane of poverty and deprivation that has afflicted these people, and to again incorporate them into the rest of the working class, not by erasing their culture and their languages and all of that. You have to follow the example of the Stalin-era nationality policy in the Soviet Union when it came to oppressed nationalities, because the old Tsarist empire was a prison house of nations. It did try to repress their native languages across the many hundreds of nationalities that composed of it. In the Soviet period, they went out of their way, even to the point of actually creating alphabets out of languages that previously had only had an oral tradition. They didn't have a written tradition. And so communists should take inspiration from that, and also the treatment of minority nationalities in the People's Republic of China is worth looking at as well. Despite what the bourgeois propaganda says, the Chinese actually went out of their way to, and rightly so, to raise the level, economic level and the educational level and the cultural level of the most oppressed and poverty-stricken elements of the population, like those in Xinjiang, like those in Tibet, who of course suffered from unbelievable deprivation and repression from the Tibetan feudal lords. And so this is something which we should look at for oppressed nationalities that exist within the borders of existing states, to make sure that we follow that example in that their culture and their languages are preserved, and that they are able to retain those elements from their past, but also that we not shove them into their own corner and don't encourage them to join the wider struggles of the proletariat in building socialism. It is perfectly possible to do both here, as the examples from the Soviet Union and People's Republic of China do show. So I'll pause now for comments from the discussion forum. H. Isaac says, I have lived in Australia for the past 24 years. I've yet to meet a middle-class Aboriginal, excluding stolen generation or mixed. Just to clarify your point, H. Isaac, you mean those who were forcibly removed from their parents and adopted by white Australians? Is that what you're referring to when it comes to stolen generation? Or mixed race Aboriginals is what you're referring to there. So you've met middle class examples of both of them. I just want to clarify exactly the point you're making there. Ash says, who is of course our correspondent and comrade in Melbourne, Yes Camp claimed that was that the voice will help because government will be forced to listen to Aboriginal people, as if the issue was that conditions are bad because they never listened to them. Yeah, and they will pick as others have pointed out, the governments in Australia will make sure that they're very careful about which voices get included. Which voices get included in whatever representational body is decided, or would have been decided upon had the proposal been accepted. It's a stitch-up. The Aboriginal community was being stitched up again by Albanese and the others committing this fraud and pretending that they were going to listen to them when they're not. There's no way they're going to let anything into the Australian system that gets in the way of the whatever the hell it is the Australian capitalist class wants to do. They want to look as if they are and pretend as if they are, but they're not interested actually in doing anything here. They're not interested in an anti-poverty program that would target specifically the Aboriginal communities. Not a real one. They might gesture at it or give some money to an NGO, but they're not going to do anything real because it would take long-term investment and serious economic planning to alleviate the extreme poverty faced by the Aboriginal communities in Australia. Neither the Australian Labor Party, never mind the Liberal National Party, is interested in that in the slightest. Nor are they going to be in the near future either. Australian capitalism is not interested in that. The poverty rate in Australia, I was actually quite surprised that it's officially 12.4%. I thought it was lower than that. So life for Australian workers as a whole is going to get worse. There's no way the parties of Australian capitalism are going to be interested in the slightest in the worst off elements of the working class, which is the Aboriginal population. They're going to pretend that they are. I mean, it's a sick joke. Ash says, prominent Indigenous Yes campaigners supported the Howard government Northern Territory intervention in 2007 in response to alcohol and child abuse. The Racial Discrimination Act has to be suspended. Nothing has changed since. The biggest beneficiaries were mining companies because the government had to acquire land. Yeah, I remember this at the time, like it was sold as a sort of Howard doing a dramatic intervention in response to like these degenerated communities. And I mean, there clearly are genuine issues there. But again, like as Ash says in her comment, the Howard government manipulated the situation to get its hands on land. So again, like this is how they act. This is they don't have genuine solutions. They, in the 2007 case, they presented a solution essentially based on state repression, and they haven't done anything serious since then. Ash adds a further comment. An author of the proposal said there won't be voting for the voice positions as it is a white idea, and later said it was due to a low turnout. That is them knowing working class Aboriginals don't trust them. Well, why would they? I mean, the more I read about this proposal, again I said the more of a stitch up it seemed, and like that we've discussed before on this channel, the way that the advanced capitalist nations don't have the capacity anymore to offer even mild social democratic reforms. And you'd need a lot more than mild social democratic reforms to dig the Aboriginal community out of the poverty that they're in. Australian capitalism isn't going to do that. Australian capitalism prefers to spend money on submarines that don't exist from Joe Biden. He's not going to spend money on seriously improving the lives of the worst off elements of the Australian working class. And so that will remain. So this is a con. This is a fraud. This is an idea worthy of Justin Trudeau himself. Because this is, as to where this goes now, I mean, I don't know if Australian comrades have any further comments on it. I haven't read the latest on this. I'm happy to return to it if Australian comrades think it's worthy of more attention. But again, like there's clear examples for us in communist history as to how the oppressed minority nationalities should be enabled to rise out of poverty in a real way and have their culture, language, and religious beliefs actually protected by a workers' state. And we have the example of the Soviet nationality policy. We have the writings of Lenin and Stalin on the national question. And now how that's approached in Australia will be something that the Australian comrades will have to work out in the course of their struggles. Clearly, though, the bulk of the Aboriginal population doesn't trust the self-appointed leaders that Albanese and others have come up for them, and doesn't have much faith in the proposals of the central government. And as to repeat my point, well, why the hell would they? Ash says, lastly, the lefties screaming about the results are making the same arguments as the lefties shocked by Brexit. Yeah, because the petty bourgeois left in all of these scenarios basically just turns around and says, well, the working class are all knuckle-dragging racists, and that's why we've lost. And they take a situation where, like, they refuse to do an actual class analysis of the situation in each case because, we have discussed this before, the left, whether it's in Australia, the United States, or Britain, is organically wedded to two things: the labour aristocracy and the trade union bureaucracy that grows out of it, and, of course, petty bourgeois academia. And that's what produces the modern left in the imperialist countries. It's no connection to the working class whatsoever. It has no connection to the proletariat at all. And all of its hysteria and all of its responses to problems like this show that. They just attach themselves to the, essentially, like, those two layers and basically the liberal end of the bourgeoisie, and then they go nuts whenever the working class doesn't live up to their imagined expectations. Yeah, the left in Australia will probably call for misinformation to be further restricted upon, just as the left in Britain was in support of, like, the efforts of that ludicrous hack Carol Cadwallader of The Guardian to try and say that it was Putin behind the Brexit referendum result. Again, like, this is just a product of how ludicrous the left is, and how it needs to be quite literally left behind now by those of us who prefer a more serious approach to the questions that are in front of us. Right, so, okay. I've been going for 90 minutes now, and I thank everybody for tuning in. I'm going to draw this to a close in just a moment, but I think we've had another interesting comment. President Jesus says, Biden is now saying the US will not join the war if Hezbollah attacks. I do wonder if that has anything to do with the non-threat made by Putin about Kinzhal missiles and aircraft carriers. You've got to wonder, haven't you? Again, I'll repeat my point. The Americans are frightened of the military capacities of the Russian Federation. They don't want to end up with a sunken aircraft carrier in a war against the Russians. So, either one of several things could be going on here. It could be the fact that that has had an impact upon somebody's thinking. I won't say Biden's, because it won't be his thinking. Or the campaign that the Israelis are going to wage is going to be so incredibly limited when it comes to the ground operation that no Hezbollah ground operation will come close to being launched. Maybe it's that. But we will know more tomorrow. I thank everybody for tuning in tonight, and I thank everybody who's contributed to the chat. Somebody made a comment earlier which I missed, actually. Gannibal 21st asked the question, how much impact the close relationship of Putin and Bibi Milokovsky in all of this? I don't know who Bibi Milokovsky is, Gannibal. So if you're in the Telegram group, drop a link or some kind of description in there, and I'll return to the question tomorrow, because I need to crack on and finish a couple of other things off now. Thank you to everybody who's contributed tonight. So PM, Banana Bender, Burke, Jay, President Jesus, Alan, Ash, multiple contributions from you tonight. Thank you. CRVS, Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk, Morgan, Austin, Slava, Michael, Satyajit, Malik, Carolus Maximus, Brian Gillespie, Zim Left Radio, and who else we got here? Yuan, Mike Martinez, Philbin, David Green, Cosmos, Lord Charfield. Okay, right. We will. Okay, Gannibal says I was referring to Netanyahu. You were referring to Netanyahu. Tell you what, Gannibal, I'll pick this up tomorrow because we will be returning to this then. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining me tonight. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Further announcements will arrive tomorrow.
Gaza.